everyone. Today we're going to continue on with the respiratory system and the structures found within it. So just to kind of help review, this isn't in your notes, you've already taken it. We covered the nose, pharynx, larynx, trachea, and your bronchi yesterday. So remember, your nose is going to be the first area that receives air. You have your nasal cavity. From there, it's going to go to your pharynx, often known as your throat. So this is where you have your nasopharynx, oropharynx, and larynx. From there, it's going to go to your larynx, known as your voice box, because it helps with speech. There, it's going to travel down to your trachea, known as your windpipe. And then when you reach the end of your trachea, it splits into your left and right bronchi, which are just passageways that will eventually lead to your lungs. And this will go to alveoli, which we discussed as being air sacs, and it's where gas exchange occurs. Okay. So here, if we show the picture again, you breathe in through your nose or your mouth. It's going to go through your pharynx, down through your voice box, your larynx, to your trachea, and eventually split into your right main bronchus and your left main bronchus. So now we're on to the lungs. The lungs occupy the entire thoracic cavity except for your central mediastinum. Because in your central mediastinum, this is where you're going to find the heart and major blood vessels associated with it. So again, it's on either side and it takes up a big majority of that cavity. Now, the apex of the lungs, which forms kind of a pointed end, is usually near your clavicle. So that's your superior or your top portion. The base rests on your diaphragm, which is found right below your lungs. It's a big muscle to help with breathing. Each lung is divided into lobes, and these lobes, we can tell the difference because they have fissures. So fissures should sound like a familiar word. We actually talked about it when we did the nervous system about fissures in your brain. So these are just very deep grooves. Your left lung has 2 lobes, and your right lung has 3 lobes. So altogether, you have 5 lobes of lungs. When we talk about the lungs, we're also going to talk about how it's protected or the covering that you're going to find on your lungs. So visceral serosa covers your outer surface of your lungs, and there are 2 main coverings because this is a double layer. So I'm going to write that up here. Your pulmonary or visceral pleura covers your lung surface. So pleur is usually associated with lungs as well. So pulmonary or pleur. Parietal pleura lines the walls of your thoracic cavity. So pleural fluid, which is just a special type of serous fluid, fills the areas between these 2 layers, and it allows your lungs to glide over the thorax, helps decrease friction whenever you're breathing. If your serous fluid gets too low, you start to feel a lot of friction, and you actually have a bunch of chest pain. So your pleural space, this is actually the space between those 2 layers, your pulmonary pleura and your parietal pleura. And this is more of a potential space to help you maintain pressure that you have between your lungs and the outer air. So here, up here, we have a picture. We have an intercostal muscle, which is located outside your lungs. Here we have the rib. Then we have our 2 layers, your parietal pleura, which again, here it's going to be against the thoracic cavity wall. And then you have your visceral pleura, visceral meaning soft organ. So over here, that's going to be in contact with your lungs. And then in between here, you have your pleural cavity. If we were going to talk about other parts of the lung that we've mentioned, we've talked about the apex of the lung up here along your clavicle, that pointed end. And then the base of your lung, which is down here, is going to rest right here on your diaphragm. The other thing we're going to talk about last is here. Notice how your right side has 1, 2, 3 lobes, and then over here on your left side you have 1 lobe and 2 lobes. Okay. Here, this is just a transverse section of your thorax that kind of shows you your lungs from above. And it kind of shows you here, yes, you have your heart in the middle, and then flanking each side are your two lungs. And again, it shows your pleural cavity and your visceral pleura and your parietal pleura to show you those as well. So from there, your lungs actually have something in them called a bronchial tree. Those two main bronchi that come into the lungs actually divide into smaller and smaller branches and form called a bronchial respiratory tree, which is just a network of branching passageways. All of those branches or passageways are usually reinforced with cartilage because we don't want them to collapse on each other, except for the very smallest passageways. These are the only ones that are not reinforced. Basically, the whole function of your bronchial tree and these passageways is to act as conduits to and from the respiratory zone, or basically a passageway for air to travel. The only ones that do not have reinforcing cartilage are bronchioles, and these are the smallest conducting passageways. Eventually, you'll get to the end of something called terminal bronchioles. So terminal bronchioles lead into the respiratory zone, and they end at something known as alveoli. Respiratory zone includes respiratory bronchioles, alveoli ducts, alveoli sacs, and alveoli, which is air sacs. It's the only place where you're going to have gas exchange occurs, which means it's going to pick up O2 and release CO2. These are respiratory zones because they are involved in the breathing process, a gas exchange. Conducting zones are structures, all other structures with passageways. So this is where we've learned about your nose, your pharynx, larynx, trachea, bronchi, etc. All of those are going to be considered conducting zones, which means they basically conduct air. Over here, this shows a diagram of your respiratory bronchioles, your alveoli ducts, and your alveoli. So here's your terminal bronchiole. Here's your respiratory bronchioles that have alveoli on them. Here you go down further, you have an alveoli duct, and then you have till the very end where gas exchange occurs. Here, this is a picture of the human lung tissue shown as a micrograph on the left-hand side, and here they've taken out a picture where it shows what it would be like if it was a drawn image. So let's go into the structures that actually where gas exchange happens, alveoli. These are a single thin layer, so single because we want diffusion to happen. So I'm going to write that on here. And it's a thin layer. It's made up of simple squamous cells, so one layer, and squamous means they're flat epithelial cells, are going to compose these walls. Now, the alveoli contain alveolar pores, next neighboring air sacs, and this actually allows air sacs to join to each other to provide multiple alternative routes for air to reach alveoli that are exposed to the outside oxygen faster. There are also things in this area known as pulmonary capillaries. So pulmonary meaning lungs, so capillaries in the lungs that cover the alveoli that allows the oxygen to be transported right into your cardiovascular system to be pumped to the rest of your body. Basically, these alveolar and these capillaries form something known as a respiratory membrane, which is an air-blood barrier. On one side is going to be air. On the other is going to be the blood flowing past. So like I said on the last slide, that oxygen can quickly go into the bloodstream and it can take carbon dioxide out of the bloodstream and you can breathe it out. So gas crosses this membrane by diffusion. Diffusion is usually a passive process, which means it doesn't require ATP in order for oxygen to move into the blood and carbon dioxide to move into your alveoli at all. So this process is passive. Now, in order to protect alveoli, because they are very important in terms of our breathing, we have macrophages. Phages mean eating, so these are dust cells that help eat other bacteria. It picks up carbon particles and other debris and gets rid of it. Another thing that your lungs are going to have is something known as surfactant. This is a lipid molecule. Lipids are basically a fat. What it does is this coats your gas-exposed alveoli surfaces. These are secreted by cuboidal surfactant secreting cells. And the whole function of these is to help prevent your alveoli from collapsing after you breathe out. You don't want them to be crushed and ruined, so it keeps them from collapsing. Here we have a picture. It's the functional anatomy of the respiratory membrane that we've been talking about, that air-blood barrier. Again, one side you're going to have air coming in, so gas-filled air spaces. Over here we have the blood vessels or your capillaries joining on. So simple diffusion can happen back and forth between these two structures. So here they have a zoomed in surface of O2 going into the blood and CO2 coming out of the blood. So that's the end of today's lesson. Let me know if you guys have any questions and I'll be more than happy to help. I hope you guys have a good day.